Natural gas is one of several commodities massively impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The European Union receives about 40% of its natural gas from Russian pipelines. About a quarter of that flows through Ukraine.
Energy is really at the front and center of the conflict that we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine. And basically, Europe is really heavily dependent on Russia for fuel, but Russia is dependent on Europe for revenue from those fuel sales. So it's really this complicated, codependent relationship that spans decades.
What we're seeing here is the consequence of Europe's allowing itself to become so reliant on Russian natural gas and oil, to the extent that, firstly, Vladimir Putin has been able to build up and modernize Russia's military, re-establish Russia as a great power capable of winning multiple wars.
Natural gas prices reached record highs in October 2021, and prices have kept climbing since, hitting a new all-time high in March. Prices on the Dutch TTF hub, a European benchmark for natural gas trading, more than tripled between February 16th and March 7th, 2022, before pulling back. The U.S., along with its partners, have imposed severe economic sanctions targeting Russia's financial institutions and members of its elites. But despite sparking the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II, Russia's natural gas continues to flow through Ukraine to Europe. Russia has been accused of using its natural gas as an economic and political bargaining chip. So what role does natural gas play in the ongoing tensions between Russia and Ukraine? And how are Europe and the U.S. impacted? Russia is the largest exporter of natural gas globally, and the second largest producer behind the U.S. For decades, Russian natural gas has powered European homes and industries. In 1968, Austria and the Soviet Union signed a gas deal, and in the early 70s, natural gas shipments began arriving in West Germany from the Soviet Union. But a 1981 CIA intelligence assessment of a proposed 3,000-mile-long natural gas pipeline from Siberia to Western Europe warned of trouble ahead. It said the pipeline would be a reliable source of gas for the continent, but it would also give the Soviets political leverage over Europe. Now those problems are ringing true.
If you go all the way back to the Soviet period and then the immediate post-Soviet period, pretty much all Russian gas flowing to Europe flowed through Ukraine. Then starting really in the 90s, Russia started building additional infrastructure that didn't cross through Ukraine.
The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 added an additional layer of complexity. After the dissolution of the USSR, many natural gas pipelines were no longer in direct control of the Russian Federation.
Russia always found it a bit unfortunate that they had to pay transit fees for transiting both Belarus and Ukraine. Now, with Belarus, they put so much pressure on the country that at some point Gazprom was able to buy the pipeline. Ukraine was always the problematic child that they didn't like and that they have problems with.
Russia has had a long-running dispute with Ukraine over the terms of their natural gas relationship. Because Russian gas travels through Ukraine, Russia pays costly transit fees to the Ukrainians.
Russia has built its entire economy on the export of hydrocarbons, and Russia is not really able to sell natural gas anywhere else than to the European Union. There's one tiny pipeline to China, but Europe, by geographic proximity, by ability and willingness to pay, was always the prominent and most liked destination market for the Russians. And Ukraine was sitting right in the middle of that.
Russia's state-owned energy company Gazprom briefly cut off gas supplies in 2006, accusing Ukraine of corruption and stealing gas from pipelines, an accusation it denied at the time. A few years later, Gazprom cut off supplies again, following a breakdown in negotiations with Ukraine over outstanding debts and prices. By 2009, around 80% of Russian gas heading to Europe ran via Ukraine. Gazprom was supplying 25% of Europe's needs. At the same time, Russia was adding additional capacity. In the 2010s, the 760-mile-long Nord Stream pipeline connecting Russia with Germany via the Baltic Sea began operations. A decade later, the Turk Stream natural gas pipeline connecting Russia's largest gas reserves with southern Europe via Turkey kicked off. Construction was completed in 2021 on the Nord Stream 2, a companion pipeline designed to double the flow of Russian gas directly to Germany. But with the Ukrainian crisis deepening, Germany froze its participation in the $11 billion project.
Essentially now having 4 big gas corridors from Russia to Europe, one through the Baltic Sea, one through Belarus, one through Turkey, all of which are controlled by Russia, as well as the one through Ukraine, which is still not controlled by Russia. And that has always upset the Russians, and they wanted to circumvent it in order to get rid of this choke point in Ukraine.
As of 2019, Ukrainian state-owned oil and gas company Naftogaz collected $3 billion a year in transit fees from Russian gas moving through its country. Crude oil and natural gas revenue made up, on average, about 43% of Russia's total annual revenue between 2011 and 2020. Each day, oil payments from Europe to Russia total about $285 million. In 2021, the European Union imported 155 billion cubic meters of natural gas from Russia. Germany alone gets half of its gas from the country. But more than a month after its invasion, and with a widening number of sanctions, why is Russian natural gas still flowing through Ukraine?
Even during this war, we're still seeing supplies flow through Ukraine, out of Russia, and into Europe. And that really speaks to this codependent relationship and how important energy is within the context of this war.
According to one analyst, it's not in anyone's interest for the flow of natural gas to stop.
From the gas industry perspective, we're not surprised. But outside the gas, if you're not familiar with the European gas industry, there's a horrible invasion and horrible war going on, and the gas is flowing generally and also through Ukraine as if nothing were happening. It does seem strange, but the fact of the matter is that Russia, as we've seen more recently, is taking a different approach with European gas.
What's happening is the Russians are making a lot of money with it. I mean, they are making hundreds of millions of dollars every day by this gas that they are selling to the Germans and the Europeans. The Europeans, on the other hand, they are highly dependent on Russian gas for filling their storages, and they are super afraid that if they are not getting the gas from Russia anymore at one moment in time, they will have to drastically cut demand also in sectors where it really hurts, like industry, households, electricity. Nobody really likes to help the other, but it's essential for each of them to keep the flow going.
In recent decades, Europe has also seen domestic production dwindle. For example, Dutch and British production declined by almost 75 and 65% respectively from their previous highs 2 decades ago. And stopping the flow of natural gas to Europe might not be in Ukraine's interest either.
The Ukrainians think, okay, we want also the money of the transit fees from this, and we don't want to be to blame for the thing going wrong, because if we are to blame if the thing goes wrong, then they're just going to switch on Nord Stream 2 and we win nothing out of that. So they try to play this very dirty game, or they have to play it, which they are certainly also not liking to see, but their alternatives are limited.
Natural gas prices in Europe and Asia reached record highs in the fall of 2021 due to increased demand from businesses and consumers returning to pre-pandemic activities. The war in Ukraine has seen natural gas prices spike yet again.
European gas markets are completely crazy right now. I mean, it's a purely political market. It's not a market about short-term supply and demand. It's not a market about long-term supply and demand anymore. It's just a market that looks into the news every day and sees how good or bad the conflict is evolving.
EU and Russia relations have been strained since Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea triggered sanctions on Moscow. Russian support of separatists in eastern Ukraine, in which about 14,000 people were killed, has also been a source of tension. But it was the invasion of Ukraine that may have had an even bigger impact on the country's role as an energy superpower. Germany froze its participation in the Nord Stream 2, a 760-mile-long pipeline under the Baltic Sea connecting Russia to Germany's coast. The pipeline, completed last September, was opposed by the U.S. on fears it would deny transit fees to Ukraine and raise Europe's energy dependence on Russia. Shell, BP, and ExxonMobil announced they were exiting multi-billion-dollar oil and gas projects in Russia. And in March 2022, the EU devised a plan of its own to reduce demand for Russian gas by 2/3 in 2022 and make Europe independent from Russian fossil fuels by 2030. But as it moves away from Russian natural gas, how does Europe intend to fuel its industries and heat its homes?
One thing that Russia's war in Ukraine is really bringing to the fore is energy policy on the short-term and long-term basis. Right now, there are all these fears about fuel shortages. If infrastructure is damaged, if Putin decides to weaponize energy and turn off the taps, what are we going to do? So right now, everyone's saying we need to pump more, we need more oil, we need more gas, just because there's this big fear that our renewable infrastructure is not quite there yet.
In March 2022, the global energy group IEA came out with a blueprint for Europe to reduce its dependence on Russian energy, including not renewing expired contracts, replacing Russian gas with alternative sources, and accelerating the deployment of wind and solar projects. While some argue the shift could help accelerate a greener Europe, the report acknowledged some remedies came with significant trade-offs, such as relying on coal or using oil within existing gas-fired plants. In the past, Russian natural gas has been a bridge in Europe's transition from fossil fuels like coal to solar and wind power. Europe hopes to become the world's first climate-neutral continent by 2050 and pledge to reduce emissions by at least 55% by 2030. Another headwind facing Europe is its gas storage levels remain below normal.
One very unfortunate situation, storages in Europe are relatively empty. Europeans want to prepare for the next winter because they know that if they are not prepared for the next winter, they will be subject to Russian blackmail in peace negotiations on Ukraine. Europeans really need to get their act together to get their storages full, otherwise we'll have the gas gun to our head and they will tell us where to sign the treaty. So we need to do something, but what gas can we use to fill our storage is Russian gas, so we are paying them more in order to be protected from them later on, which is a very unfortunate situation.
The continent could find some relief, however, from America's natural gas market. U.S. exports of natural gas have soared to a record 5.3 trillion cubic feet in 2020, 13% higher than the previous year. More than half of U.S. natural gas exports that year were shipped via pipelines to Mexico and Canada. The remainder were sent overseas as liquefied natural gas. The U.S. and its partners intend to provide an additional 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to the EU this year.
It's important to note that we're already at max capacity. We're already sending record amounts to Europe, and that's a change from prior years. Essentially, what happened is that cargoes that were heading to Asia were diverted and went to Europe instead. Now, a lot of that was because of pricing dynamics. If you're going to get a higher price in Europe, you're going to send your cargo to Europe rather than to Asia.
And energy-intensive exports produced in the U.S. could also help alleviate some of Europe's need for Russian natural gas, too.
There are also certain intermediate products or even final products that the US could export, be it things like paper or steel, but also ammonia, methanol, so things that are highly energy intensive that the European industry and the European consumers like to use, but where we should not use too much gas for at the moment because gas is in short supply if we don't want to rely on the Russians.
But for the moment, natural gas seems to be caught in the crossfire of the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
It's not a small conflict somewhere in the backwaters of the oceans, but it's really one of the global and determining conflicts of our time. And what might happen, and currently it seems quite likely to happen, will be a complete unbundling of the Russian energy superpower and the European super energy consumer.